Good day, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to the G20 Interfaith Forum Working Group on Human Trafficking. My name is Duncan Jepson, and I am the Senior Advisor to the Santa Marta Group. Kevin Hyland asked me to provide a short presentation and say a few words about our perspectives and strategies for combating human trafficking. Prior to joining the group, I was the founder and led the NGO Liberty Shared, which did a lot of work on anti-money laundering as it relates to human trafficking and on corporate accountability in supply chains. Before that, I was a solicitor and head of legal and compliance at two of the largest investment management firms across Asia Pacific. Framing the problem is essential. The International Labour Organization publishes an annual figure of the number of victims in modern slavery. Last September, they reported that just under 50 million people were in some form of modern slavery. This is an important number as it helps us understand what resources are required to provide care to victims and also to further help survivors as they reintegrate into society. But this might be a misleading figure in relation to protection of vulnerable people, and particularly in relation to the needs of criminal justice. When thinking about vulnerability, perhaps a place to start is how many people are below a poverty line. There are several poverty lines that we can use, and the World Bank provides several figures. But perhaps if we choose $6.9 a day, we can see that 3.6 billion people in 2019 were below this number. This is certainly a number that would create financial precarity and perhaps tempt people to take opportunities that are high risk. This is important when we consider the number of people that are able then to report on these high risk situations and the amount of information that they can provide about their experiences and also the individuals and groups that are seeking to exploit them. Internet access therefore becomes key, and what we see is that only 65% of the global population are using the internet. 35% are simply not accessing it, and therefore a huge amount of information is absent and lost. Some of this is going to translate in the ability of law enforcement to actually act as a deterrent, but also use criminal justice as a means of convicting and prosecuting traffickers. The State Department records the annual figures of prosecutions and convictions, and what we see over the last 7 years is that these are merely in their thousands. So we have a problem where victims are counted in the tens of millions, vulnerable people possibly in the billions, but convictions of traffickers merely in the thousands. Criminal justice and the deterrence and then the protection of vulnerable people through law enforcement lag severely behind. And we believe this is an area that must be addressed. Global supply chains are not merely complicated, they are highly complex. And this has been more fully appreciated by the general public since the pandemic. However, this complexity and argument of complexity has also lent support to the reasoning that corporations and their suppliers have given as to why they are unable to identify and address forced labor and other labor abuses in their supply chains. It is of course true that supply chains have to adapt, and there are a whole range of different pressures on global supply chains that constantly mean that they must be moved and must change. However, this is a situation that is not unique to production commodities. If we think about the financial services industry, post 9/11 and post the war on terror, and then in relation to money laundering as it relates to drug trafficking, the financial services industry was told that it was unacceptable for them not to have the right measures in place to identify money laundering, and that it would be unacceptable to say that they simply couldn't tell because it was too complex. And these days, any financial institution that has a suspicion of an activity related to money laundering must report it immediately. This situation is very far away in production and commodities industries. However, there are some examples of law enforcement actions in relation to forced labor in commodities and production industries that are worth looking at. First is US Customs and Border Protection's efforts in relation to import bans on goods that are made wholly or partly with forced labor. This has been controversial, but at the same time, I certainly have seen it effective in relation to the palm oil industry and the fishing industry. Most recently, there have been efforts in the sugar industry in the Dominican Republic. And although there is still work to be done, what we do see is that people are taking note and work is being done to start alleviating abuse on the sugar plantations. A second line of action has been Department of Homeland Security's Homeland Security Investigations Office, which has been using criminal legal powers to investigate forced labor and supply chains. Last year, they did an investigation into forced labor in Goodyear Tire and Rubber Corporation's subsidiary in Malaysia, Goodyear Malaysia Berhad. And this led to a considerable settlement to the workers, which was considered to be intergenerational. These, however, are beginning steps, and much more needs to be done to apply criminal justice as a deterrent to global supply chains. Forced commercial sex exploitation, or sex trafficking. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime offer a number of important trends that we should consider here. First is that traffickers are operating with greater impunity. The number of investigations and convictions is falling. And this is reflected in the numbers that the State Department presented in their TIP report. Secondly is that boys and men make up a greater number of victims. Thirdly, women and children face an increasing amount of violence. And I think most importantly here is to consider that there are more organized traffickers. Organized groups are an increasing proportion of sex trafficking perpetrators. And they are operating for longer, abusing people for longer, and using greater violence in doing so. These are extremely worrying trends. And in a sense, they show that either we are discovering more and more information about how it operates, and we are learning what we simply haven't known before, or the situation is worsening. What we call for here, of course, as we have done previously, is greater investment in law enforcement and criminal justice to act as a greater deterrent. I believe that strategies to fight modern slavery can be divided into three simple categories. First, strategies that address the human element, care and protection for victims and vulnerable, and investigation and prosecution against perpetrators. Secondly, in relation to the products and services that arise from exploitation, cessation of services and seizure of products is crucial. Finally, to identify and seize revenues and proceeds that arise from the sale of products and services. In the 2000-2010, I was heavily involved in urging the financial services community and financial institutions, particularly across Asia Pacific, to take seriously the proceeds that they were transacting arising from sex trafficking and from forced labor. This work culminated in working with the Financial Action Task Force and eventually contributing to the publication of their guidelines in 2018. At that point, it was gratifying to see financial institutions take seriously the issue of transacting proceeds of a crime relating to modern slavery. However, there are two sides to this story. The first is that we do want the financial service industry to take part in fighting modern slavery and therefore identifying proceeds. But we must also recognize that they have benefited from this, and in some cases where they've provided loans and credit facilities in relation to production and manufacturing, they have of course enabled forced labor and labor abuses in particular. And that may be something they're less willing to address because it involves clients that they may have had for many years. We need to work harder with the financial services community to unravel some of these conflicts of interest and complexities in order that we have a better financial services community thinking about the victims and the vulnerable of modern slavery. Sustainable Development Goal 11 is to create resilient communities, communities that can stand up on their own and thrive, socially and economically. That will not be possible if they are constantly undermined by organized crime and poverty and the need to seek opportunities that may be high risk and lead to exploitation. When we think about those who are vulnerable, we find that there are perhaps billions of vulnerable people to those circumstances. And we also find that the protection of those individuals and those families is very limited, with arrests and convictions merely in the thousands. What we ask for today, and what is proposed by Kevin Hyland, is that there is $30 billion made available by 2030, a 30 by 30 goal. This would put forward the idea that criminal justice is fundamentally important, that it is not just about arrests, convictions, it is actually about making communities resilient and helping to provide protection so that they do not require endless social security and government funding to support them, and that we can see communities stand up on their own and be able to cope resiliently with the conflicts and with the difficulties and challenges that lie ahead. I hope the discussions in the rest of the workshop go well, and thank you very much for listening.